Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about government legislation and how Elizabeth planned to create new laws to provide relief and assistance for those who needed it most in England. We'll mainly be focusing today on something called the Elizabethan Poor Laws, and this was a series of laws made throughout her reign as queen that offered not only guidance for government ministers and officials such as JPs, but it also set out the laws as to how vagrants would be supported and also dealt with if they were committing any kind of criminal acts. So our title today is Government Legislation, our learning objective to understand Elizabeth's plan to help the poor. And your starter is to write numbers 1 to 7 for your quickfire questions. So we can go ahead and pause the video now. Please do hit resume playing when you're finished writing 1 to 7, and then you'll be tackling your quickfires for your starter. So having a look at our responses for those 7 quickfires, question number 1, how many hours each day did the average person work? And if we're thinking about the average individual, most people worked in a particular industry. We're looking between 12 to 14 hours a day for farming. Question 2, what was the main difference between a vagabond and a vagrant? Well, vagrants traveled from place to place. Vagabonds stayed put in a particular town or village. When Edward was king, who was responsible for helping the poor? So we know that this fell onto 2 different groups of responsibility. The first was the church, and the second was the wealthy. So the church was expected to be able to use the charity funds that they brought in through the congregation, and the wealthy were also expected to make contributions to the poor in their local areas. Number 4, what did most people do for work? This kind of links back to question number 1. We know most people were involved in agriculture. Number 5, what were the 3 main religions in the Elizabethan era? They were Protestantism, Catholicism, and Puritanism. Number 6, what or government official was in charge of law at the local level? And that's the Justice of the Peace, or the JP. And lastly, government official who collected poor rates, who was very easily corrupted. We know that this was the overseer of the poor. So now we're going to take a look at the impact that vagrants had on society, but also some of the common views that people had about vagrancy and those that would come into their villages. The first one is vagrants were typically blamed for an increase in crime rate. Now, there is some fact in this, where we know vagrants like rufflers or doxies or hookers, anglers, they were just common criminals. When they came into villages, they committed crimes such as theft to be able to try to make ends meet. But there were other types of vagrants who weren't criminals per se, people like a counterfeit crank, or an Abraham's man. These were individuals who either pretended to have a mental or physical illness, or they used some element of deception or dishonesty to try and get charity. So they weren't going out and stealing from people, but there was this belief that if a vagrant came into your village, there would soon be a following rise in crime rates. The next was more based in fact, but also based a bit in fear. It was the spread of disease. So when these vagrants would come into a particular village, sometimes groups of vagrants exceeded 80 to 100 people. And when they entered villages, many of those who were living there were quite concerned about where the vagrants had previously visited. At this time in England, villages were rather cut off from each other. You would travel within your local area to a degree, and you may go on a pilgrimage, perhaps to London or to Canterbury Cathedral. But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of time for you to be going and traveling all over the country. What this did mean is illnesses would often be isolated in particular regions. And in your village, there might have been a strain of the flu, for example, that you had built up an immunity to over time. And every single October or November, when it was flu season, you had an immunity to that virus. If a vagrant is coming from a different village, they could be carrying a different strain of the flu. Now, remember, the Elizabethans didn't quite understand how viruses and diseases spread. All they knew was these vagrants came into my town or village, and now I'm really ill. They did cause an increased fear of rebellion, particularly when rufflers would come into towns, and simply because they were ex-soldiers, they were typically more willing to use force or violence to be able to get charity or to get money. And in doing so, people did fear if there's 40, 50, or 60 rogues or rufflers coming into my town, what are they going to do? Are they going to try and take over the town in some way? Those who had jobs had to pay poor rates. This was really difficult for especially the poorest of those who worked in the farming industry. They really did work hard to make ends meet and were getting quite frustrated that more and more of their financial income was now being devoted to paying the poor rates. And we've talked previously about those two different types of poor people, which we will just mention again in a moment. But many of those in the Elizabethan era were quite frustrated by what we call the able-bodied poor. And we'll take a look at that momentarily. And the last one, general concerns just around public safety. Again, when these large groups of vagrants were coming into towns and villages, many people did feel unsafe. They worried about that rising crime rate we mentioned. They worried about the spread of disease. They worried about a rebellion. And all of this just caused kind of a general sense of unease among the local population. So we'll go ahead, we will hit pause on the video now. We'll get that title down and those 5 key points. And when you're finished, you can go ahead and resume playing. So here's Elizabeth's main approach to poverty. Now we know roughly 30% of the population was living on the verge of starvation, and the population grew really rapidly just around the time of Mary and then kind of moving into the time of Elizabeth. And previous monarchs really didn't do a whole lot to help the situation. They went more the route of punishing those who were committing vagrancy. One of the most common punishments was actually made by Edward. I think we've talked about it before, but he would brand vagrants with the letter V. And branding is something that is still used, not as commonly today as it was about 20 years ago, but it was commonly used in the livestock industry, where farmers would have a hot iron bar similar to what you see on the screen with either the name of the farm or the initials of the farmer. It would be heated up till it's red hot, and then it would be pressed into the skin of the animal that they owned. And this was a way of marking that animal, making sure that there was no chance they would get mixed up with another farmer. More common today are the tags you might see in the ears. So if you've ever driven by a farm and you see maybe sheep or cattle, and they have often a neon colored tag in their ear. That's a much less painful experience for the animal, but also an easier way. If the animal was sold to someone else, they just simply changed the tag. But we know Edward, he was branding the letter V into first of all, the palm of a vagrant. The second location was on the forehead. If they were caught the third time, it was on the cheek, just kind of below the eye. And on the fourth occasion, if they had those three marks, the fourth occasion was most often execution. We know that the charitable system could simply not cope. There were too many vagrants, and there weren't enough people actually giving in taxation for the Queen to be able to help. So this is where Elizabeth realized, I need to kind of rework the system. As it is right now, I have too many poor people and not enough money to help them. And Queen Elizabeth did not have the money herself to be able to pay to support those individuals. What this led to is the realization that Elizabeth had to actually change the laws. She said what was working under Edward and Mary won't work any longer. So she decided to pass a series of laws we call the Elizabethan Poor Laws, and these actually remained in place for about the next 200 years. They were so effective. They didn't solve the problem of poverty, but they went a long, long way to addressing the issues and to helping those who needed it most. It's quite similar to what we talked about with President Roosevelt. He realized he could just give Americans cash, he could give them money, but they would become very dependent on the government. So Elizabeth, much the same, made a realization, if I just give people money, they'll become dependent on me. But if I give them skills, if I give them jobs, they can earn their own money and they can also contribute to society. So a lot of what Elizabeth does under the Poor Laws, you'll do some reading, you will see that has a lot to do with giving skills. So skills such as woodworking or cabinet making, it was a major industry in the Elizabethan era. So we'll go ahead, we'll hit pause again on the video here. We'll get down those 3 key points, and when you're finished, you can resume playing. So as promised, here we have the 2 different categories of the poor. Remember, Elizabeth had to make sure she had a very, very clear distinction between who was deserving of assistance and who was not. And the categories that Elizabeth came up with were the impotent poor, and these are those who cannot work. They have a legitimate reason, or a reason the government saw as legitimate, such as they were too old, they had a physical or mental disability, they had a limitation of some sort. We see on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is a man who returned from war. He's lost his right leg. So for that reason, he's not able to work as a farmer in the fields, and Elizabeth would categorize him as an impotent poor person. On the other side, there were the able-bodied poor, and they were considered to be able to work. They were just not really willing to do so for whatever reason. It was seen that these people would have to be forced to go and work in the Elizabethan workhouses rather than going out and begging. And they'd be given that opportunity to go and acquire a skill that could translate into a job or even a career. And if they refused that help, there was always the possibility of going to prison. And many Elizabethans know prison was not a place you wanted to wind up. Prisoners had very, very few rights. The conditions in prisons were absolutely dire. So going to the workhouses, learning a skill was often much preferred rather than being sent to prison. I know we've looked at these key terms before in previous lessons. If you would like to pause the video to go ahead and get a definition of each, more than welcome to. Otherwise, you can just keep playing. So getting back to the previous legislation under monarchs such as Edward and Mary, we have to remember that they were more focused on punishing vagrants rather than helping vagrants. And we can get a couple details about what these monarchs actually did and the limited impact that their interventions actually had. So Henry, for example, in 1536, he ordered that all vagabonds were to be whipped. This was most often between 5 and 10 lashes, and 1 lash was enough to actually create very, very deep cuts on someone's back. Edward in 1547, we know that he was branding vagabonds with the letter V and giving them 2 years hard labor. But despite these laws and interventions, a number of beggars continued to rise. And the message that that actually gave to the government is people aren't vagrants because they want to be. People are vagrants because they're forced to be. And they're forced to be in this position where they don't have money, they don't have a job, and they are now resorting to begging, not as a decision, but as a means of survival. So something that Henry and Edward didn't really recognize is I need to help, not hurt. Elizabeth is going to see a slightly different side of how she can offer some support to vagrants. So again, just like always, we'll pause the video here. Let's get down those 5 key points, and then we can resume playing. So looking at Edward's approach of branding, for example, and giving 2 years hard labor, let's just take a moment just to reflect and write some ideas down in our books and some things to consider when we're thinking about how Edward was dealing with the problems versus how should Elizabeth deal with the problems. We'll consider the following. So the problems vagrants actually caused on society. So think of the difference between maybe a ruffler coming to your village versus a counterfeit crank. The able-bodied versus the impotent poor. Who should actually be responsible for helping those who need it most? Who should receive help and who should not? And are there any consequences for those who fail to follow the rules? So imagine that you're Elizabeth, and just write some ideas down as to how you would deal with vagrancy, considering those points that are at the bottom of the screen. So we'll pause it now. We'll take a few moments just to jot down some ideas, and then we'll continue. So if your ideas had anything to do with helping vagrants, offering them skills, if you were thinking kind of along the lines of Roosevelt, or even what Hitler did in Germany in the 1930s, you're certainly on the right track. And what we're going to start looking at now are the specific laws and regulations that Elizabeth was introducing to try and change the situation with vagrancy. So the result of a series of acts we called the Elizabethan Poor Laws, or the Elizabethan Poor Laws of 1601. This was the very first time, this is important for us to remember, this is the first time the government said, it's my job to help the poor. Henry never did that, Edward never did that, Mary never did. Elizabeth was the first monarch in history to say, the poor are my responsibility. In the series of acts, she distinguished clearly between those who deserve assistance and those who don't. So we can go ahead and think of the terminology we use in terms of impotent, we're deserving, able-bodied, we're not deserving. And the last one is she put in place a system to deal with each type of poor person. And this would be the different types of work that she would have offered. So we'll go ahead, we'll put those 3 in our books, and when we're ready, we'll hit play. So to reflect back on the Elizabethan Poor Laws, we always ask ourselves as historians, how successful were they? It's like asking the question, how successful was President Roosevelt's New Deal? How successful was Truman's policy of containment? How successful was Hitler's policy of Lebensraum? We always like to evaluate what was the goal of this particular individual and what did they actually accomplish. So what we have to understand is poverty did not end. It's not as though Elizabeth brought in her poor laws and suddenly everyone was wealthy and everyone was getting on just fine in England. That didn't happen. There were still lots of poor people, but there was now an organized system to monitor and to provide relief for those who need it most. So the impact was actually kind of mixed. So in some areas, poverty continued to rise. However, laws did help thousands of people in need, particularly those to get jobs. Now, when these people got jobs, the threat of social unrest, the threat of rebellion was reduced. And for the first time, the government said, this is on us. Helping those who need it most is now our responsibility. And the system Elizabeth set up in 1601 actually remained in place until the 1800s. So it was a good framework to use. It did provide those who needed it most with assistance, but there were some tweaks needed by the time the Industrial Revolution came around in terms of the work that people were doing and the skills that they were acquiring. So let's go ahead and pause the video now. Let's make a clear note that it did not end poverty, but it certainly did go a long way to introducing a system to help reduce poverty. Now, if you're looking at this lesson inside of a classroom in school, you will probably have access to this worksheet to be able to fill in various facts about the different acts that make up the Elizabethan Poor Laws. If you're completing this lesson from home, you might not have access to that worksheet. So you are more than welcome to use the information on the screen here to be able to make some notes about it. But if you don't have the worksheet, we can do this as a mind map instead. So if you've got the worksheet, we'll pause the video now. You can also use your textbooks if you're in the classroom. If you don't have the worksheet handy, we'll have a look at making some mind maps instead. So worksheet, we'll pause the video now. If we don't have the worksheet, we'll leave it play through. and we'll make some mind maps. So if we don't have the worksheet, that's all right. These are 3 of kind of the more important, shall we say, acts that made up the Elizabethan Poor Laws. If you can go ahead in your books now and make 3 mind maps, one for the 1572 Vagabonds Act, the 1576 Acts for the Relief of the Poor, and the 1598 Act for the Punishment of Rogues. What we'll be able to do is pause the video. We'll be able to backtrack slightly. If you rewind to the table we saw previously, you'll be able to use that to make the information necessary. So we'll go ahead and either rewind now if we need to, we'll pause the video, and we can play it in a moment just to have a look at the various facts for each. So if you would like to have a look on screen now, again, we've got kind of 4 key points for each of these acts that made up the Elizabethan Poor Laws. You can double check your answers, see how you did. And as always, we'll be able to make sure we have a chat with your teacher or take this up in the classroom if you do need any extra help. But thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoyed.